Welcome to Excel 2013 PowerPivot video number 1. Hey, if you want to download this workbook, PowerPivot number 1, intro.xlsx, you can click on the link below the video. Hey, so in this series, I don't know how many videos there will be, but we're going to talk about PowerPivot in Excel 2013. Now, I am not an expert in PowerPivot. I have been studying it for a while, and I guess my conclusion is I'm not that good at it. I am not a hardcore database guy, and I don't know enough about the advanced DAX formulas. However, I have seen some amazing glimpses of how awesome PowerPivot can be. So I'm going to do an introduction series, and then as I learn more later, I'll make more videos. However, there's lots of dudes out that are just amazing with amazing resources on data modeling, advanced DAX, and all sorts of stuff. Marco Russo, Alberto Ferrari, Rob Colley, Casper De Jong, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Chris Webb, Bill Jelen, all of these websites and all of these guys have books. They are just amazing. All right, so in this first video, we're going to talk about some of the basics and look at a couple examples building the data model and then some reports in PowerPivot. Now, let's go over to the sheet. Which versions in 2013? Office 2013 Professional Plus, Standalone Excel, and Office 365 E3 or E4. Also some SharePoint versions. Now, I have this one, and they work fine. All right, now in installing PowerPivot, hey, wait a second, I already have mine installed. It's easy. Once you get your Excel version, you simply go to Options, then Add-ins, and then down to Excel add-ins, and we want COM add-ins, go. And you simply check your PowerPivot for 2013. Click OK. All right, now let's go over and talk about why PowerPivot is so amazing. It, in essence, is going to be a report building system that has benefits above normal Excel tasks. Because there's some situations where we're going to use pivot tables, right? And maybe VLOOKUPs in Excel, and we don't ever want to go use PowerPivot. But here's the things that PowerPivot does. One thing it does, and this is the genius, right, of Microsoft, they actually use the pivot table user interface that we all know and love. Now we have to learn stuff about data modeling and a lot of new DAX functions. But it's the pivot table user interface that we all know and love that we can still use. Drag and drop fields, boom, we have our report. Now, I think the most amazing thing about PowerPivot is its in-memory columnar databases. Now, there's lots of synonyms for this, and we'll come over in just a second and look at all the synonyms. But really, it's amazing because that columnar database, the X-velocity engine inside of PowerPivot, allows large data sets to come into Excel, and it will help in contributing to fast formula calculation speed. So you really can have a lot of data, and a lot of it has to do with the actual internal database. Now, handling large data sets, that is amazing. And in our next video, we'll actually import a large data set, actually a non-normalized data set, and see that when you import it into PowerPivot, it will dramatically reduce the file size. So you can bring big data. That is a very important point of why we'd want to use PowerPivot. Faster calculating than large array formulas. Now I'm going to show an example in the third video of that. But really what's amazing about this columnar database and the DAX formula language is it's dealing with big data, and it calculates really quickly. Allows you to pull data from more than one table. So yeah, you can bring lots of different tables and then build relationships between them without using VLOOKUP inside of PowerPivot. That's pretty amazing. However, there's a big caveat down here, and I'll show you an example right in this video. There's many times when you have small data sets and you want a quick couple of reports, and then it's just as easy to use a helper column in VLOOKUPs and not use PowerPivot. VLOOKUP still has its amazing uses in Excel. So even though PowerPivot allows us to build relationships between tables where we could replace all of our VLOOKUP functions, there's lots of situations where VLOOKUP is still going to be the way to go. So we can pull from different data sets, build relationships. We can also connect from multiple different external data sets. And the amazing thing is they'll all come in and we can build one data model and they all sit in this columnar database. It's just amazing. And then we can refresh with a single keyboard, Control Alt F5. The other amazing reason for PowerPivot is the DAX formula language. It dramatically increases the formula possibilities for a pivot table, right? And we'll see calculate, count unique, total year to date, and all sorts of other amazing functions. And portable formulas. I first saw this word in Rob Colley's books. Portable formulas, it means we'll be able to build a formula and add the number formatting in one place and then use that formula in many pivot tables. Again, the idea of PowerPivot is we're going to build a reporting system, right? So we'll build our formulas once, and then we can use them in lots of pivot tables. Another amazing thing is we'll be able to build a pivot table with really complex calculations and then convert them to cube functions. And then you have the benefits of functions. Also, we'll see how we can import multiple tables and their relationships all at the same time. And when it imports into PowerPivot, it will retain the relationships. Now, hey, when to use PowerPivot, kind of a little summary. Hey, we have the pivot table user interface for our reporting system. We have big data from multiple sources. Again, PowerPivot can reduce the file size and decrease formula calculation time. And we'll have that increased formula language and that portable formula. Those are just amazing features of PowerPivot. Hey, when not to use PowerPivot? Hey, Excel. Normal Excel is not going away. Millions of Excel users every day have Excel tasks that do not involve large data sets or multiple data sources. Hey, regular payroll, cash flow analysis, depreciation tables, on-the-fly calculations. And if you have a small data set with multiple tables, yes, you could import it into PowerPivot, build relationships. But sometimes it might be just as easy to use helper columns and VLOOKUPs, and we'll see an example of that. And of course, when you don't have big data, just doing some simple pivot tables, the pivot table in Excel still rules. Now let's go talk about this awesome columnar database. Hey, there's lots of synonyms, and as I read books and stuff, it was referred to as a lot of different things. PowerPivot database, columnar database, data model, Excel data model, PowerPivot database stored in an Excel workbook, PowerPivot X Velocity engine, and on and on. All of these are synonyms. You hear them thrown around. Actually, the Ferrari and Russo book gave good distinctions for some of these. I'm going to tend to stick to columnar database because I think that is the coolest thing. And so, hey, let's just take a look at what a simple example, a visual example of what this columnar database does. It's going to save space and contribute to faster formula calculating times. Hey, a regular normalized data set we might have. We have sales rep, and then we have some keys, and then we have these tables, right? So if we were in Excel, we might have to do a VLOOKUP to populate this table with sales rep names. And we might have to do the same thing for region. Now in database, and you relate these tables with relationships. So this would go to there. This would go to there. Primary key over to a foreign key. Now these normalized data sets are very common inside of PowerPivot. And most of the examples that I'll do, and actually most of the examples you see in books and blogs, are exactly like this because that's how people store data. But check this out. This is a non-normalized data set. Notice we just have sales rep and a bunch of repeats. So not normalized. It wasn't broken apart into its tables. But here's the thing. When you import this non-normalized table into PowerPivot, it's going to look through and store each column in a separate entity, a separate column, right? And only store the unique value. So if there's only 4 sales rep, boom. If there's only 3 regions, only 3 items. And that kind of, and I'm no expert in this, but from what I read, that's what contributes to smaller file size and helps with some of the formula calculations because when it has to look through this one column, there's only a few items here. Now let's go look at some examples. Why not PowerPivot? And I'm going to power through this one fast, right? here's the situation. We have 1, 2, 3 tables. And I'm going to quickly show you an Excel example, and then we'll come over here and see our first example of PowerPivot. But hey, if I just need a quick report based on region, right? Here's the region. It looks like we have duplicate sales rep, but we're going to have to do some lookup to get the region there. Oh, and also we only have discounted units, and we need price, right? So quickly, I'd make a formula. I'm going to equal round, and I'm going to do VLOOKUP. I'm going to look up the product name, comma, within the table. F4, comma, 2, comma, 0, close parentheses. That'll get the price. I'm going to go times, and then in parentheses, 1 minus the discount, close parentheses, time the number of units, comma, 2, close parentheses. Now, this same example, we'll see how this works over in PowerPivot. Now, one thing is if you're already used to Excel, you know how to use VLOOKUP, right? When we get over to PowerPoint, we're going to have to learn a new function called related. Control Enter, double click, and send it down, right? So let's see, Control down arrow. This is about 10,000 rows, so we're going to consider that a small data set. Notice it didn't, I double clicked and send it down. The formula didn't have any trouble, right? Region, we just do VLOOKUP. I'm going to look up the sales rep name, comma, within this sales table over here, Control Shift right, down arrow, F4, comma, 2, comma, 0, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click, and send it down. Now I want to stop here a second and think about what we just did. As Excel people, we have no problem creating what's called a helper column, right? To create revenue, and then create another helper column, in essence, to bring the region information over to this table. Now we have a single cell we can make a pivot table from. Now, we don't usually think of this as data modeling. We Excelers, we just think, oh yeah, we need these helper columns to get one table so we can create a pivot table that will summarize revenue by region. But check this out. What we really did is we had 3 different tables, and we needed to arrange the data, in essence, model the data in a certain way so we could get our end result report, which is region by revenue. So when we get over to PowerPivot, we're going to have 1, 2, 3 tables. We're actually going to bring them into PowerPivot. And where they come into PowerPivot is called the data model. Over there, we will actually create a helper column. We won't have to use VLOOKUP. We'll use related. But we won't have to have this extra region column, because we will actually build a relationship between this column in our transaction table and the sales rep table. We'll build a relationship instead of doing VLOOKUP. The point here is, even if we were over in Excel and we never thought of it in these terms, this is a way of data modeling, creating our data so we can create the end result report. All right, let's see how to create our pivot table from our Excel version. Now I can click in a single cell. I have empty cells all the way around this. Alt-N-V. I'm going to put it on this existing sheet right up here. Click OK. So I can scroll over. And now, because I have all of my columns or fields in one table, I simply take region, drag it to rows, and then my revenue, drag it to values. And just like that, I have my sum of revenue. So if our goal was simply to have this basic region revenue table, and we knew how to use Excel, 10,000 rows, no problem. Now, let's go see how to do this over in Excel. Because what if we didn't just have one simple table to do, but these 3 tables are going to be the basis of many reports? We wanted access to more function language in a pivot table, and we wanted to have portable formulas where we can build the formula in one place and use it many times. So let's go over to this PowerPivot first example. All right, so we have these 3 tables. Now, these tables are all on one sheet. They could easily be on separate sheets. They could easily be in separate workbooks. They could be in a single database. Each table could be in different databases. This data be coming from the web, all sorts of different locations. In this first example, we'll just see the 3 tables from a single worksheet. Later, we'll see other different examples. All right, now the thing is, before we can put this table 1, 2, 3 into PowerPivot, we actually have to convert them to tables. All right, so you ready? I'm going to click in the first table, Control T, Enter. Now I'm going to name this table. I could go up to the Design and Table Name Properties up there, but I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-J-T-A. Instantly we get jumped up to Table Name. We're going to call this D for Dimension Products. Enter. Now we click in the next table, Control T, Enter, Alt J T A, and we're going to call this one D Dimension and Sales Rep. Enter. Arrow, arrow, Control T, Enter, Alt J T A, and we're going to call this F for Fact. Transactions. Enter. So we have 3 tables. Now that kind of makes sense, right? Because we want everything to be dynamic. So by forcing our data sets in Excel to be tables, that way if we expand, it'll all be dynamic. Now, I kind of glossed over some Alt-J-T-A. Why did I start with a D and call this dimension? Hey, that's databasing terms. These are, to Excel people, these are the lookup tables, right? And this is the transaction table. Hey, this is the transaction table. That's called a fact table in databasing. These are the dimension tables. So for Excel people, transaction, lookup, lookup. For database people, fact, dimension, dimension. Now we need to get 1, 2, 3 these tables into PowerPivot. And there's a few ways we can do that, but I'm going to go ahead and use the PowerPivot ribbon. Sure enough, there's an Add to Data Model. So we can simply click. And when we click, it'll open up the Manage Data Model window. So I'm going to click Add to Data Model. Notice my cursor's in the first table. Whoop. And instantly, we could see our table. And look down here. There's a Sheet tab with our name and a little link that says it's linked. Now, this is the Manage Data Model area. And there's a few different ribbon tabs: Home, Design, Advanced, and Linked. And we'll see those throughout these videos. We're going to go back over to our Excel window. Now, this is a separate window, and I'm going to use Alt-Tab. So here's the Excel window, Alt-Tab, back and forth. This is Excel proper. This is behind the scenes in PowerPivot. Alt-Tab, they're all being saved together in the same file. Now I click in the next table, and instead of going PowerPivot, Add to Data Model, I'm going to use the keyboards. And check this out, Alt, and it's a B in 2013. So I hit B, and then it's Y. So we're going to use Alt-BY, and instantly we have our table. There's our name, there's our linked, and there's our table. Alt-Tab, arrow, 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 Alt-BY. So instantly I can see there's 10,000 records. There's the name, there's the linked. Now for each one of these tables, they're on a separate tab. So we can come here and do things like format. We can add extra columns called calculated columns, and we can add calculated fields down here and in other locations. But before we do that, let's go up, and this is the Home ribbon. We're in Data View. We want to go to Diagram View. Here we can build our relationship. So I'm going to click Diagram View, and there's a few different places you can build relationships. Now here's our fact table. And there's a few ways, different conventions. Actually, Rob Colley likes to put the dimension or lookup tables above, because it reminds you, later we'll learn that when we have relationships, the filters or criteria from our pivot tables flow from the dimension or lookup tables down to the fact table or transaction table. So that's one way to do it. Another way is called star schema, and there you have all the dimension tables around the fact table. Here we just have 2 tables, so we can put them however we'd like. So what we're after in this window is relationships. And remember, the relationships replace VLOOKUP. Here's price. We actually are going to need that price. And if we go back to Excel, right, here's the price. But in order to use it over in this table, we need to somehow get it over there. VLOOKUP in Excel, over in PowerPivot, we create a relationship. Now, there's a few ways we could do this. We could go to Design, Create Relationship, Escape. The easy way is just right here in our diagram view. I'm simply going to drag and drop. And this is similar to access, if you know access, I'll drag and drop, and instantly there's a relationship. Now, it kind of bothers me that this one isn't highlighted, but whoop, you can see that. You can actually right-click this, edit relationship, or delete. I'm going to say edit, and here's the window that we could have used if we went to create relationship. And the way it works is, here's our, on top, the fact table or our transaction table. There's the column. Down below, notice they use the word related lookup table. So they're anticipating, really, that maybe some Excel people would look at this. They didn't put dimension there. They put lookup. So this is the lookup table, and there's the lookup column. Click OK. Now, we need to learn something about relationships. In databasing or over in Access, we'd actually see a many symbol right here, an infinity symbol, and a 1, because this is a one-to-many relationships. Now, we Excel people, let's go look at Excel. We may have not thought about it in these terms, but if this is the lookup table, we already know from using VLOOKUP there can only be one of each in the first column of the lookup table, right? No duplicates allowed. Now, although there are some circumstances where Excel, we use lookup functions with duplicates, like matching two lists, in a real lookup table that is going to be used between two tables, we know that the first column has to have exactly one of each item. So there's only one quad here. There can be many quads over here, because this is where we sell the item, right? So when we look up this quad over here, there better only be one, because we're looking up one price. One to many. So in Excel, we may never have thought about it in those terms. But over in PowerPivot and in databasing, you think about it in those terms. One to many. So there we have it. Now, because there's a relationship between product and product, we can use the price over here. We can use the price in a calculated column or a calculated field. We'll see both of those later. Now, we also need to relate sales rep, right? So I'm going to drag over there. Now, whereas over here, we're going to actually use the price in probably some formulas. Here, we could use region now in some formulas. But probably we're going to use this in the row or column area of our pivot table. In fact, watch this. Right-click, delete. This is a great thing to do. I'm going to delete it from the model. Let's just go ahead back to the home, and I'm going to create a pivot table. And we're going to see that all three tables will show up. Boop, I'm going to click, and it will put it on a new worksheet, and it will put it in our Excel workbook. Click OK. And now look at that. That's pretty amazing. Let's see. Normal pivot table do that. We're allowed to have three tables. Totally cool. So if we were to drag from sales rep region down to rows, sure enough, it's looking like it's going to work. But if we came over here, if we wanted to do something like add units, we're not going to get the right answer. We get each one of our total. You can see all the way down. Now, we could create it here, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to come over here and delete this whole sheet. We're going to create the relationship back there. But that's what would happen if we didn't have a relationship. So I'm going to delete. Yeah, we're going to delete it. Alt-Tab. So now we have sales rep. Instantly, we can drag it there. And before we even go back and do formatting stuff, let's do that same pivot table again. I'm going to click OK. And now we can go to sales rep region and go to transaction and units. And now we get the correct totals, each for individual one, without VLOOKUP. We used relationships. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to come over here and right-click delete. So relationships are pretty cool. Alt-Tab. So now get this. One to many, one to many. This is the start of our data model. Now, we're in diagram view building relationships. But that's what we're doing in this manage data model. Everything we're doing back here is to build the data models. We have our relationships. Now let's go do some more data modeling. We'll go back and add formatting and some formulas. Now let's go back to data view. We want to talk about each one of these tables. And sometimes it might be polite for yourself, if you're ever going to look at the data, to come and change column width and do some formatting. So changing column width, you can simply click and drag. Here's our price. We can click in the top cell, come up to the formatting group and click currency. English, and instantly the whole column has our formatting. If we come over to D-Cells, we can change the column width. We'll come over to transactions. Now dates, and we'll talk about dates and grouping and calendar tables in a later video, but they always come in with times and dates. So we can click on the top cell, format, and select some format. We'll select this one. Change column width. Change the column width. Now for discount, we could add a % if we want. I'm not going to. Units. You could easily, in any one of these columns, come up in sort. So sort oldest to newest, and instantly the earliest dates are on top. All of that is so if we want to look at the tables, they're a little bit easier to understand. Now, there's this bottom part is called the measure grid, and you can actually point to the gray line and click and drag. We'll have an example of a calculated column, and then we'll have an example of a calculated field, and we'll create it down in the measured grid. Now, we're going to create a calculated column first. And in a later video, we'll talk about some of the main differences between calculated columns and calculated fields. But for this video, we just want to see how to create that revenue column. Now, it says Add Column there. I'm going to come here and double click and then call this Net Revenue, and then Enter. Now, remember the first thing we did is the first thing we did was round, but we'll come back to that later. We actually have to do a VLOOKUP because we want to bring the price over here, multiply it by 1 minus the discount, and times units. Well, VLOOKUP doesn't exist in PowerPivot, so we're going to have to learn the new function related. Hey, I'm going to click in this cell right here, and watch what happens when I type an equal sign. It immediately goes up to the formula bar. So we have to create our formulas in the formula bar. Now, related are E tab. Related means, hey, there's a relationship. And guess what? All I have to do is get the column name, actually the table and column name, from the related table. And I want price, so check this out. I'm going to click down on D products, click on price, and instantly check this out. This will be our convention when we're building formulas. We're going to have our table name, and then in square brackets, our field name. Now, if you remember tables over in Excel, right? Table formula nomenclature or structured references, hey, they use table names and field names in square brackets. Access also uses this convention. Now, I'm going to close parentheses and watch this. Enter. Instantly, it got all of the prices. Now, check this out. What do we do? All we did was give it the field name from that other table. What it's doing is in each row, it's getting the correct price from that other table. Now, in PowerPivot, we're going to learn that there's something called row context. So right here, this related products price, well, it knows that there's a relationship between the products column. So it sees sunshine in this row, goes over to that other table price, and gets the correct price. Down here, the row context sees quad, so it gets from that price column over in the products table 34, and so on. So row context is something that happens in calculated columns. Later, when we learn calculated fields or measures, we will learn that there's something called filter context. So that's pretty cool, row by row. Another strange thing, check that formula out. If you looked at any cell in this column, they're all the same. Now, normally over in Excel, what do? We have a relative cell reference. You'd be looking at sunshine. Relative cell reference, you'd be looking at quad. But no, not here in PowerPivot. Row context, same formula all the way down. It always knows because of row context. Now, let's click up here, and we want to amend this formula. I'm going to come to the end, and times open parentheses 1 minus. Now, watch this. We're certainly allowed to simply click on the discount, and the row context will know that discount comes from this table. But I'm going to follow the convention I learned from Russo and Ferrari. Anytime we're referring to some column, I am going to use the full table name. Now, watch this. I clicked in the beginning. Before the square bracket and discount, I type FT, and instantly I can see that T means table, and I'm going to hit Tab. There we go. That's the convention I'm going to use. And the reason why is later when we create calculated fields or measures, and we use those calculated fields in other formulas, then we'll use only square brackets. Now again, this is a convention. It would work perfectly fine with just the square brackets and discount. All right, so we have that, close parentheses time, and now I'm going to do FT tab, open square bracket, and I'm going to down arrow to get my units tab. Now, I have completed this. I have the related, which is VLOOKUP. I have 1 minus the discount from this table and the times the units. Enter, and instantly that formula goes all the way down. Now, these have some unrounded numbers, so I'd like to round. So I'm going to come up to the formula bar and click right after the equal sign and type ROU tab. I'm going to hit the end key to jump to the end right there, comma 2, close parentheses. Now check this out. Round works just as it does over in Excel. So there are some functions, DAX functions they're called over here in PowerPivot, that work exactly the same as Excel. Related is an example of a function that's DAX function in PowerPivot, but it's not over in Excel. Hey, I'm going to hit Enter. Now, check this out. I want to go back before we build a pivot table. As an example, I want to go back to our Excel workbook and remind ourselves, we did the revenue with VLOOKUP and round and all that. Notice we had number formatting here, but when we built our pivot table, that number formatting does not flow from our column to the pivot table. In essence, every time we use that column, we have to right-click and number formatting or value field settings. Now, if you make lots of pivot tables, that's a hassle. That's an extra step. Let's go back to PowerPivot. Watch this. I'm going to use number formatting on this, currency English. All right? This is a calculated column. Later we'll see with calculated fields or measures, it's the same thing. If you apply the number formatting, now it will carry forward any pivot table that you use. Now here, this is a calculated column. This will show up in our field list. Later we'll have a calculated field. It'll be a formula that will show in our field list too in our pivot table. So let's just quickly build a pivot table. I'm going to click OK. It drops to a new sheet. Region and net revenue. Boom, that number formatting. We can make 10 other pivot tables, and that means 10 fewer clicks to apply that number formatting. Now what we did right there, that's a calculated column, but notice we dragged it and dropped it down here and relied on the internal functions of the pivot table, sum, count, etc., to do our calculation. That's called an implicit calculation. And in building your data model, you want to stay away from implicit calculations. You actually want to make explicit calculations, which means over in our managed data model, we want to use the sum function to add up the column and then have a separate field called total net revenue over here. All right, so I'm going to delete this sheet, and we're going to go over and see how to create a calculated field. Alt-Tab. Here, that is our calculated column. Now we want to come down here and create a calculated field in our measure area. Now, you could create it down here, or you could go back to Excel and PowerPivot calculated fields, new calculated fields, and use this dialog box. Now that's fine. I'm going to create my calculated fields over in the measured grid. All right, so we're going to add up this, and we're going to create an explicit measure. Again, we're not going to rely on the pivot table internals. We're going to create the sum function here. And the advantages are you build the formula once here, which is going to be the sum of net revenue. And you can use it over and over again, including in other DAX formulas. So watch this. Whereas up for a calculated field, we'd say the equal sign, and then our formula. Here we have to actually create the name. So I'm going to type, and I'm down here, but watch. As soon as I start typing it, will jump up to the formula bar. So I'm going to say total, and just like that, I'm jumped up to the formula bar. Total net revenue. And then you type a colon and then an equal sign. Now, if you've ever done formulas over in Access, you've seen the convention of creating the calculated field name and then a colon to indicate that everything after that is a formula. So now we're going to use the sum function. we're going to use the table name FT tab, open square brackets, and now we're going to use the net revenue. There it is, tab, and then close parentheses, enter. Now we want to come and expand the column and notice that the number formatting, there is none. So we're going to number format. You can right click number format, or we could just come right up to this format group and apply English. Now if we were to go back over to PowerPivot, ribbon tab, calculated fields, we could go to manage calculated fields, and there is our calculated field. We could even click edit, okay? And notice that the currency is applied here. We have our formula, escape, escape, close, alt tab. But we created it instead of in the dialog box right down here in the measured grid. All right, now in this video, these are the only two formulas we're going to do. In later videos, we'll do lots more formulas. But let's go and now build our pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And let's look at our list. Now we're going to have net revenue and total net revenue. Let's go up and get our region. Scroll down, total net revenue. Now, something interesting is going on here. It's called filter context. Now, back over in PowerPivot, we saw row context, right? This formula knew to look up quad because it was in this row. Calculated fields do filter context, and it's all about which cell in the pivot table the actual calculation is sitting in. So right here, remember, that's sum of all the revenue. But because in this cell in the pivot table sensing one condition, Midwest, it literally goes to the underlying data model and filters everything so just Midwest is shown. Now, we don't see that. If we were to go back and look at the data model, right, and see on the sales rep table that everything's filtered or that everything's filtered here. But in essence, that's what it's doing. Filter context means whichever criteria you drop into your row, column, filter, or slicer, that determines the criteria for filtering the underlying data set. So if I go over and drag a new condition down under, I'm going to drag products under rows. Now we have in this cell right here, it's East doubler. So there's two criteria or two filters being applied to the underlying data set, and then that calculation is made. When we get here, it's East and flat top. Filter context. Now later, when we get to the calculate function, we'll talk more about filter context and how it interacts with the pivot tables and functions like calculate. All right. That is just this first video, Alt-Tab. We saw how to build a data model, import some tables. We saw how to create a relationship in diagram view. We saw how to create a calculated column and calculated field. A couple examples of simple pivot tables. In our next few videos, we'll see a couple short examples of how if you import huge data sets into Excel and PowerPivot, it can reduce file size. We'll see a comparison with an array format and a couple other kind of cool housekeeping things before we get into a big comprehensive problem where we'll get to see lots of cool things about PowerPivot. All right, see you next video.